The studio audience at the Arsenio Hall show had been loud all evening. That changed the moment Jean-Claude Van Damme leaned forward in his chair, looked directly into the camera, and said that Chuck Norris belonged to a generation of action stars the world had already moved past. The laughter that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then someone in the third row recognized the man sitting in the green room on the other side of the studio wall. The word moved fast. By the time it reached the front row, the laughter had stopped completely. Chuck Norris had been scheduled as the second guest that night. Nobody had told Van Damme. That moment in the autumn of 1991 did not begin with a rivalry. It began with a business, a genre, and two men who occupied the same corner of it with different ideas about who had earned the right to be there. Chuck Norris was 51 years old. His competitive karate record, 6 consecutive world championships through the 1960s and early 1970s, remained unmatched in American martial arts history. He had retired from competition before Van Damme had ever entered a tournament. By 1991, Walker Texas Ranger was in development. Missing in Action, Code of Silence, and Delta Force had already established him as the defining face of American martial arts cinema through the previous decade. He had built that career the way he built everything, through the practice first, the camera second. He did not talk about his record. He did not need to. Jean-Claude Van Damme was 30 years old and arriving at the peak moment of his commercial visibility. Double Impact had opened 2 months earlier. Lionheart and Kickboxer had reached wide audiences in the previous 2 years. He was fast, genuinely skilled, and photogenic in a way that the camera rewarded without effort. His background in Shotokan karate and ballet-influenced flexibility had produced a screen presence that American audiences found compelling. His competitive record in full-contact karate in Europe was real, though considerably more modest than the version that had circulated through his early publicity materials. He had won tournaments. He had not dominated a national circuit for 6 consecutive years against the best available opposition. The distinction mattered to people who understood the practice. Van Damme had not yet learned which rooms contained those people. The Arsenio Hall show taped on a Wednesday. The booking had been made separately for the two men, scheduled back-to-back as part of a standard multi-guest format. The production assistant who handled the green room logistics later said in an interview that she had assumed both guests were aware of the other's presence on the bill. They were not. Van Damme arrived first at 6:15 and was seated in the primary green room. Chuck arrived at 6:40 and was shown to the secondary holding area closer to the stage entrance. The wall between them was thin enough that conversation carried, but neither man had reason to be listening for the other. Arsenio Hall opened the show at 7. Van Damme came out first, to the kind of crowd response that a man at the height of his commercial moment receives from a studio audience that skews young and enthusiastic. He sat down. Hall asked about Double Impact. Van Damme talked about the physical preparation, the diet, the training schedule. He was comfortable and naturally entertaining, quick with his hands when he wanted to demonstrate something physical, fluent in the specific language of a man who had spent years selling his body's capability to rooms that wanted to believe in it. The interview moved well. Then Hall asked the question that changed the evening. He asked Van Damme where he saw himself in the action genre, specifically how he thought about his place relative to the generation of stars who had defined the 1980s. Van Damme smiled. He paused for exactly the length of time a man pauses when he has thought about an answer before and is deciding whether this room is the room to give it. Then he gave it. He said the 1980s action stars had been important. He said they had opened doors. He said that Americans liked their heroes big and simple and that for a long time that had been enough. Then he said that audiences had grown up. He said the new generation wanted speed, athleticism, real technique, not just a big guy with a beard throwing slow punches. He used the word dinosaurs. He said it lightly, with the smile still on his face, in the way that men say sharp things when they want the sharpness to be deniable if the room turns cold. The audience laughed. Hall raised an eyebrow but kept smiling. Then Van Damme went further. Hall had not asked him to. He said Chuck Norris specifically, and he said the name clearly, not as a passing reference, but as the example he had chosen because it was the one he wanted to use. He said Chuck Norris was a legend, the word coming out with the particular intonation that makes legend mean finished. He said the kind of karate Chuck represented had been replaced. He said it was a different era, and the old guys needed to understand that. The audience laughed again, shorter this time. In the secondary green room, Chuck heard his name. A production assistant standing near the door later described the moment. Chuck was sitting with a cup of coffee and a folded newspaper. When he heard his name come through the monitor, he set the coffee down. He did not change expression. He listened to the rest of what Van Damme said. Then he looked at the production assistant and asked quietly how long until he was due on stage. She told him 12 minutes. He nodded. He picked the coffee back up. Out in the studio, something had shifted. The third row was where it started. A woman who had been at the taping later described it in a post on a martial arts forum in 1997, one of the earliest documented accounts of the evening. She said that someone near her had whispered Chuck Norris's name, that the whisper had moved forward through the rows, and that by the time it reached the people closest to the stage, the laughter from Van Damme's last comment had already drained out of the room. Not because anyone had said anything, because the room had just understood something that Van Damme had not yet understood, which was that the man he had been describing was approximately 40 feet away. Hall knew his producer had come to the edge of the stage and made a small gesture. Hall processed it mid-conversation, kept his expression neutral, and let Van Damme finish the point he was making about the evolution of the genre. Then Hall said they needed to take a break. The band played. The floor manager crossed the studio floor quickly. What happened during that commercial break has been described by 3 people who were present: the woman from the forum account, a camera operator interviewed in a 2003 documentary segment about the show's production history, and a segment producer who gave a brief account in a podcast in 2019. The accounts differ in small details but agree on the essential sequence. Van Damme was told during the break that Chuck Norris was the next guest. The camera operator described Van Damme's face in that moment as going through several expressions quickly. The segment producer said Van Damme asked twice whether there was any way to adjust the segment order. There was not. The show was live. The rundown was fixed. Chuck was already at the stage entrance. Chuck walked out when Arsenio introduced him. The audience response was immediate and genuine, not the enthusiastic peak of a crowd greeting a man at his commercial moment, but the specific warmth that a crowd extends to someone they have respected for a long time and whose presence carries the accumulated weight of that respect. He shook Hall's hand. He turned to Van Damme. He shook his hand. He sat down. Hall, to his credit, did not pretend the previous segment had not happened. He was a skilled enough host to understand that the room already knew that attempting to redirect the conversation towards something safe would produce exactly the awkward television he was trying to avoid. He said directly but lightly that Chuck had probably had a chance to hear some of what Jean-Claude had been talking about before the break. Chuck said he had caught some of it. Hall asked what he thought. Chuck looked at Van Damme for a moment before he answered. Not a long look, 2 seconds, maybe 3. The kind of look that carries its own message before any words are attached to it. Then he turned back to Hall. He said that Jean-Claude was a talented fighter and that the films were impressive. He said he meant that. Then he said that talent and a record were 2 different things, and that he had spent about 15 years building the record before he ever stood in front of a camera, and that the record had a way of making certain conversations shorter than they might otherwise be. He said it without raising his voice. He said it with the slight, unhurried quality of a man who is not performing composure but who is simply composed. The audience went silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of a room watching a confrontation it did not want to see. The specific silence of 400 people who have just heard something said with enough quiet authority that the normal social responses, laughter, applause, reaction, are insufficient, and so the room simply becomes still. Van Damme said something. Accounts differ on the exact wording, but the substance is consistent across the sources. He said something to the effect that he had respect for Chuck's career and that he had not meant any disrespect. He said it in a tone that had moved a significant distance from the tone he had been using 4 minutes earlier when he said the word dinosaurs. Chuck nodded once. He did not expand on what he had said. He did not offer the extended version of the point that would have required Van Damme to respond to it. He simply nodded, which is what a man does when the thing he said was the whole of what he intended to say, and the thing that followed it is the other person's responsibility to carry. Hall moved the conversation forward. He asked Chuck about Walker, Texas Ranger. Chuck answered. The rest of the segment was professional and civil. The audience warmed back up. By the end, both men were sitting in the posture of people who have moved past something without discussing it further because the discussion had already happened in the 45 seconds before the conversation changed direction. What the audience had witnessed, and what the room had gone silent for, was not an insult returned. Chuck had not mocked Van Damme. He had not catalogued the competitive record in detail. He had not explained the 6 championships or named the opponents or described the circuit. He had said one thing: That talent and a record were different, and that he had the record. Everything else was implied by what he did not need to say. The distinction between what Chuck Norris was and what Jean-Claude Van Damme was at that point in their careers was not about screen presence or commercial performance. It was about the specific question that martial arts ultimately always returns to, which is whether the capability has been tested against genuine opposition under conditions that do not permit a favorable outcome to be arranged. Chuck's career before the cameras had been built entirely in those conditions. The 6 consecutive world championships had been won against men who were trying to prevent him from winning them on circuits that had no commercial interest in producing a particular result. Van Damme's competitive background, while genuine, had not been tested at that level or across that sustained duration. Van Damme understood this. That was visible in the 45 seconds. A man who did not understand it would have pushed back harder. He would have defended the comparison, extended the argument, pointed to his own record. Van Damme did none of that. He offered the acknowledgement that men offer when they have said something in a room and then discovered that the room contained someone with more standing on the subject than they had accounted for. Chuck's response on that stage was the response of a man who had been hearing versions of the same argument for 30 years. The argument that the era had changed, that the new generation had superseded the old, that the standards had shifted in a direction that made the previous standard less relevant. He had heard it from men who were larger than Van Damme, and from men who were faster, and from men who had more impressive competitive records than anything the Belgian action star could point to. He had answered the argument the same way every time, which was not by winning it through language but by making the comparison available in a form that did not require language to resolve. He did not make that offer on the Arsenio Hall stage. The stage was not the place for it, and the evening was not the occasion, and Chuck Norris had never in his public life done anything that the occasion did not call for. What the occasion called for was one measured response to a public remark, delivered without theater, and then the conversation about Walker, Texas Ranger. That was what the occasion received. The segment producer who spoke about the evening in the 2019 podcast said that in 20 years of live television production, the moment Chuck sat down and delivered that single response was the quietest she had ever heard a studio audience become during a guest segment that had not involved a death or a medical emergency. She said the silence lasted about 7 seconds before the first person began to applaud, and that when the applause started it came from the back of the room first and moved forward, which was the reverse of the usual direction, and that she had never seen that happen before or since. 7 seconds of 400 people deciding that what they had just heard did not need supplementing. Van Damme continued making films. His commercial peak ran through the mid-1990s before the market shifted and his output moved toward the direct-to-video format that eventually became the primary channel for his work. He gave an interview in 2012 in which he spoke about Chuck Norris with straightforward respect, calling him one of the genuine martial artists of his generation, and acknowledging that his own early confidence about his place in the genre had been, in his word, excessive. He did not reference the Arsenio Hall show directly. He did not need to. Chuck launched Walker, Texas Ranger in 1993. It ran for 8 seasons, 200 episodes. At its peak, it was the most watched drama on American network television. The audience that Van Damme had described as having moved past the generation Chuck represented showed up every week for nearly a decade and brought their families with them. The genre did not pass Chuck Norris by. It continued long enough for the audience to see what a career built on a real foundation looked like across the full length of the building. That foundation had been laid in dojos and on competition mats in the 1960s, before the cameras and before the studios and before any of the commercial machinery that the word action star eventually came to mean. By the time a 30-year-old Belgian fighter sat in a television studio and used the word dinosaurs, the foundation was already 30 years old and had not moved. The audience went silent because silence was the accurate response. Some things do not require applause to be acknowledged. They require the room to become still enough to hear what was actually said. That is what 400 people did for 7 seconds on a Wednesday evening in 1991. They got quiet enough to hear it. The evening did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. That is the part of the story that the 7 seconds of silence tends to overshadow, because 7 seconds is the moment people remember and the moment people repeat. But what happened after the taping wrapped, in the parking lot, and in the days that followed, carried its own weight. When the show ended, both men walked off the same stage in the same direction because the stage exit led to a single corridor and the corridor led to the same parking area. The production assistant who had been managing Chuck's green room was walking behind both of them. She described the corridor moment in the 2019 podcast segment. She said the two men walked about 8 feet apart, neither of them rushing, neither of them deliberately slowing. She said Van Damme said something as they reached the exterior door. She said it was brief and that Chuck responded with a nod, and that they went to their separate cars without anything further passing between them. She did not repeat what Van Damme said. She said it was not for her to repeat. She said only that it was not hostile and that it was not an apology in the formal sense, but that it carried the weight of one. That detail matters. A man who believed he had been right does not say anything at the door. The fact that Van Damme said something, anything, in that corridor told its own story about what the 7 seconds of studio silence had communicated to him. Chuck drove himself home. He did not call anyone about the segment that night. His longtime manager at the time confirmed in a 2008 interview that Chuck mentioned the taping the following morning, only in the context of asking whether the Walker Texas Ranger production schedule had been affected by the evening's late finish. That was the entirety of his engagement with the event. The segment had happened, it had resolved itself. He was already thinking about the next day's work. The clip circulated through the martial arts community in the weeks after broadcast. In 1991, this meant VHS copies, recorded off television, passed between schools and gyms and training partners across the country. Instructors showed it to senior students. Tournament organizers mentioned it at events. The specific version of the story that traveled was not the version about Van Damme's confidence or Chuck's composure. The version that traveled was about the silence itself, about what it meant that 400 people in a television studio stopped making noise for 7 seconds because one man said one thing without raising his voice. Practitioners understood it immediately. The silence was the room recognizing something that the room did not have words for, but that the people inside it who had spent years on training floors could identify without words. It was the specific recognition of a man who had been tested and knew it and did not need to perform the knowing because the record already performed it on his behalf. Van Damme had been tested too, genuinely, and had come through the testing with real skill and a real record. But the scale of the testing and the duration of it, and the quality of the opposition it had been conducted against was not the same. That gap was what the room had gone silent for. Not to embarrass Van Damme, to acknowledge Chuck. There is a documented account from a Shotokan instructor in Phoenix who had been watching the broadcast live that evening with 6 of his senior students. He wrote about it in a newsletter his school distributed to members in November of 1991. He said that when Chuck delivered the response about the record, one of his students, a man who had been competing for 11 years and who had never been particularly interested in celebrity culture or television, stood up from his chair without saying anything. He just stood up. The instructor said he understood exactly why. He said, "You stand up when you hear something true said plainly by someone who earned the right to say it." That newsletter account is one of the few documented civilian responses to the broadcast from the period. Most of the reaction existed in conversations that were never written down in gyms and dojos and training sessions where the topic came up and was discussed and eventually settled into the category of stories that the martial arts community keeps because the stories say something true about the practice that formal instruction sometimes fails to convey. What it said was this: reputation built in front of cameras is a different thing from reputation built on mats. Both are real, both require work, but only one of them survives the moment when someone in the room has the other kind and the room is quiet enough to feel the difference. Van Damme's career continued producing that difference throughout the early 1990s. He worked hard. His physical preparation for each film was genuine and demanding, but the commercial machinery around him was built on a version of his story that had been amplified past what the underlying record supported, and commercial machinery of that kind has a specific vulnerability, which is that it works until it encounters someone whose record speaks at a volume the machinery cannot match. Chuck had no machinery running that evening. He was sitting in a secondary green room with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. He had not been briefed on Van Damme's comments. He had not prepared a response. He had not consulted anyone about what to say. He heard his name, set the coffee down, waited 12 minutes, walked out, sat down, and said one thing. That is the detail that the martial arts instructors who showed the clip to their students always paused on. Not the 7 seconds, the 12 minutes. The fact that a man can hear himself described as a dinosaur on live television, wait 12 minutes in a back room, walk out under studio lights in front of 400 people, and deliver a single composed response without any visible sign that the 12 minutes had contained anything other than patience. That quality, not the technique, not the record, not the championships, was the thing that 40 years of genuine practice had built in him. The ability to hear something, place it in its correct proportion, and respond to it at the size it deserved rather than the size the emotions of the moment wanted to give it. Van Damme gave his 2012 interview in Brussels to a Belgian sports journalist who had been covering his career for several years. The full transcript was published in a French-language sports magazine and later translated and circulated online. The relevant section ran approximately 4 paragraphs. He said that when he was young, he had a habit of speaking before he fully understood the room he was speaking in. He said it was a Belgian thing, or maybe just a young man thing, or maybe just his
things.
And like he said he had made that mistake on American television once, in a way that he had thought about many times since, and that the lesson it had taught him was not about the specific man he had underestimated, but about the general principle of understanding what a record actually represents before deciding that the record belongs to the past. He did not name Chuck Norris in that passage. He did not need to. The journalist knew, the readers who knew both careers knew, the people who did not know could find out with a single search. Chuck was asked about Van Damme in a separate interview in 2014, during a promotional period for one of his later projects. The interviewer mentioned Van Damme's name in the context of the evolving action genre, and asked Chuck how he viewed the Belgian star's contribution to martial arts cinema. Chuck said Van Damme had brought something real to the screen and that the physicality was genuine, and that audiences had responded to it for a reason. He said nothing about the Arsenio Hall show. He said nothing about 1991 or the 7 seconds or the silence. He moved on to the next question. That is what the ending of this story actually looks like. Not a confrontation resolved through dominance. Not a public humiliation followed by a lesson learned on camera. 2 men in their careers, decades later, speaking about each other with the professional respect that time and distance produce when neither man has any remaining reason to be anything other than honest. The 7 seconds happened. They meant what they meant in the room where they happened. Then both men went back to work. That is the whole of it, and the whole of it is enough.